Hi everybody, and welcome back to another installment of Quarantine History. I thought it would be a nice idea to talk a little bit about the three principal column orders of ancient Greek architecture. So the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. I discussed column orders a little bit in the virtual tour of the Acropolis of Athens, and it seemed to me a good idea maybe to do a little tutorial to refresh everybody's memory. So let's jump right in. What are columns and why are they so important? For the ancient Greeks, columns were much more than just a way to hold up a building. Every section, from capital to shaft to base, was an interconnected part of a greater whole, of an architecture that reflected the order of the universe that the ancient Greeks believed in and tried to make sense of. Ancient architect mathematicians employed a ratio called the golden mean, something we discussed in the Acropolis of Athens video. It's something found in nature in nautilus shells or ram's horns, for example. And they used this to try to both make sense of the otherworldly and achieve perfection in their worldly lives. Today, we know that the principle underlying these forms is, of course, the Fibonacci sequence. Classic Greek architecture is timeless. It was developed in ancient Greece as a way to decorate what are called post and lintel structures. The post part is the vertical section of a building, and that supported the horizontal elements, which are known as the lintel. This idea was adopted by the Romans after the Greeks and has since consistently been used in the Western world in neoclassical architecture. What is neoclassical architecture? It's a term we use to describe buildings that have adopted elements of ancient Greek and Roman temples and structures and used them in the design of modern buildings. If you look around most cities in the West, and especially capital cities, you'll start seeing this influence everywhere. We use neoclassical architectural principles for buildings that we consider to be important, so government buildings or civic buildings, banks, but also for buildings associated with the arts, so museums, libraries, theaters. Before we talk about the three column orders themselves, let's talk about the different elements or different parts of a column in general. Ancient Greek temple columns sat on a flat horizontal surface known as a stylobate, something like the floor of the temple. The lowest part of the column, which sits on the stylobate, is known as the base. The oldest column order, the Doric, which we'll talk about in a little while, didn't actually have a base but went straight into that stylobate or the floor. But both the Ionic and the Corinthian styles had bases that sat on top of that floor. The next part of the column is known as the shaft, which consists of sections that are called drums. The drum sections were connected to one another, and the precision with which these carved pieces were put together meant that it was almost impossible to see where one drum ended and the next began. At the top of the shaft sat the most defining feature of a column, and that was, of course, the column capital, the top. Just by looking at these capitals, you can immediately identify which order the column belongs to. And finally, on top of the columns is a slab called the entablature. It's not part of the column itself, but it's an interconnected, let's say, part of it. In classical times, the entablature would be decorated with metopes separated by three carved lines that were known as triglyphs. Above the entablature is the triangular area known as the pediment, which was often filled with sculpture. Now let's talk a little bit about each of the column orders chronologically and in order of the simplest to the most ornate or fancy. We'll start with the oldest column order, which is known as the Doric, and which has its origins in 7th century BC, mainland and Western Greece. A good ancient example would be the Parthenon in Athens, although it's not a purely Doric structure. And a modern example would be the Lincoln Memorial, for example, in Washington, D.C. This first column order, the Doric, was the most severe and heavy and associated with the masculine form. It's remarkable in its simplicity and unity. It was really popular with the ancient Greeks, especially in the 5th century BC. Its defining features include a shorter, thicker column shaft with a shallow disc-shaped kind of capital, the top part, that rests on a square top. The shaft itself was fluted all the way around. Now, what is fluted? What does fluted mean? Fluting is the vertical grooves that decorate the shaft. In the case of the Doric column, there are usually 20 flutes, sort of channels, let's say, that are carved around the column that meet at sharp edges all around. The bottom part of a Doric column rests directly on that base, or the stylobate, meaning that there is no base of the column. When you look at the columns, you assume they're straight and uniform in thickness, but in reality they're not. The shaft bulges about a third of the way down and tapers towards the bottom as well as towards the top, which is actually the narrowest point of the column shaft. This is known as entasis, and it was an architectural technique employed to give a sense that the columns were alive and breathing and larger than they actually were. Now let's talk about the second of the 3 column orders, the Ioniq. It originated in the 6th century BC, so about a century after the Doric order, and it's a much more delicate, feminine column, which is lighter in appearance. A good example of an Ionic temple from antiquity is would have been the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A modern example, again in Washington, D.C., would be the Jefferson Memorial. Ionic columns have large ringed bases that sit on a square pad and that raises the whole column off of the stylobate. Moving up the column, we see that the shaft part is much more slender than its Doric counterpart, with deeper fluting, and that fluting is slightly separated. Each channel is slightly separated, leaving a strip of unfluted column between each of the flutes. And Ionic columns usually had 24 flutes carved into them, in opposition to the Doric, which only had 20. Again, however, the defining characteristic of an Ionic column is its capital. The Ionic capital had a scroll shape, and the scrolls are called volutes, so they have what we call voluted capitals, similar to the shape, again, of a nautilus shell or a ram's horn. So here, the Fibonacci sequence is clearly on display. In between the scrolls, or the volutes, is a decorative device that's known as the egg and dart motif. And finally, we come to the third and most ornate and decorative of the column orders, which is known as the Corinthian. A good example of an ancient Corinthian temple would be the temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens, while a modern example, once again in Washington, D.C., is the U.S. Capitol building. There's an interesting story about the origins of the Corinthian capital. So legend has it that one day in the 5th century BC, the sculptor Callimachus of Corinth saw a basket sitting atop a young girl's grave. The basket had been filled with the girl's belongings, and a tile had been placed on top of them so that they wouldn't fall out of the basket. Well, underneath or close by to that basket was an acanthus plant. Acanthus is a plant that grows wild all across Greece. And that plant had actually grown up and intertwined itself with the basket. And he saw this and was inspired to sculpt the column capital that became known as the Corinthian. Corinthian columns have a base, so like the Ioniq, a long, slender fluted shaft, similar again to the Ioniq, and it has 24 flutes around it. The shaft of a Corinthian column is usually taller than the Ioniq or the Doric columns. Its distinguishing feature, again, is the capital, with its florid outburst of acanthus leaves and scrolls, like the Ionic column capital. Corinthian columns were the column of choice for the Romans, who liked nothing more than fancy, ornate things, in contrast to their Greek predecessors who preferred more understated elegance, like the Doric column. An easy way to remember the 3 column orders in chronological order, and again in order from the simplest to the most ornate, is that each word gains a syllable from simplest to the fanciest. So first Doric, 2 syllables, second Ionic, 3 syllables, and third Corinthian, 4 syllables.